Eastern Afghanistan, 2004. In the late afternoon, on a ridge above a dry wadi in the Spira district of Khost province, Pat Tillman is kneeling behind a boulder with an army ranger called Brian O'Neill and an Afghan militia soldier called Syed Farhad. A Humvee comes around the corner of an opium field below them and opens fire on the ridge. Tillman waves his arms, he shouts cease fire, throws a smoke grenade to mark his position, and the firing stops. But then it starts again. A round hit him in the chest plate of his body armour. He stands up and he shouts, "Why are you shooting at me? I'm Pat Tillman. I'm Pat fucking Tillman." 3 rounds strike him just below the rim of his helmet, in a grouping the width of 2 fingers. The men in the Humvee are rangers from his own platoon. The chronicles of ancient and medieval battle rarely mention men killed by their own side. Jeffrey Reagan, in his book Backfire, puts it simply: accidents on the battlefield were so common they weren't worth writing down, unless the man struck down happened to be a leader of note. The classical historian Victor Davis Hanson describes the Greek battlefield as a place of confusion, misdirection and mob violence, with no clear line between friend and enemy. Uniforms weren't greatly worn in European warfare until the middle of the 17th century. For most of recorded history, a soldier identified the man he was trying to kill by where he was standing, what language he shouted in, and whether his face looked familiar in amongst the dust. Thucydides was amongst the first to record an incident of its kind. In 413 BC, during the Athenian night attack at Epipolae, outside Syracuse, the Athenian forces came apart in the dark. In his account, the Athenians fell into great disorder and perplexity, taking all in front of them for enemies, even those who might be some of their fleeing friends. 800 years later, at Adrianople in AD 378, the Roman historian Ammanus Marcellinus had written about a legion that was destroying itself. The companies had become so pressed together that few could even draw their swords. As the men at the rear struck at the men at the front, clouds of dust blocked out the sky, and the fighting echoed with frightful cries. In August of 1460, King James II of Scotland was besieging Roxburgh Castle. He was fond of his artillery. One of his great hooped bombards, an early kind of cannon he'd named Lion. He was standing beside it when he ordered it fired, and it exploded. A piece of wrought iron struck him in the chest and killed him where he stood. The Earl of Angus, along with several gunners, were wounded. The king was 29 years old. By the end of the 19th century, artillery had moved. It no longer fired from the front lines alongside the infantry. It fired from miles behind it, at ground the gunners themselves would never see. Forward observers passed coordinates back, and shells rained down. In the book Americide, Charles Schrader argues that indirect fire at an industrial scale, combined with a fighting doctrine that demanded massive preparatory bombardments, made friendly casualties so common as to be almost an unremarkable aspect. The first soldiers of the British Expeditionary Force to die in France were killed by British infantry. A battery of horse artillery attached to the 5th Division was moving towards the village of Le Cateau at nightfall, sending riders ahead to scout the road. The local civil guard, composed of untrained Belgian peasants, saw the riders coming and heard them speaking in a foreign language. They panicked and opened fire, so the horsemen turned and rode hard back towards their lines. British infantry pickets saw them coming at a gallop, presumed them hostile, and fired down the road, killing one man outright and mortally wounding another. Reagan notes that there was 2 men dead, but the 5th Division had not yet seen a German. A year later at Loos, the British Army used chlorine gas for the first time. Of 50,000 British casualties in that battle, 2,361 were poisoned by their own gas, drifting back across no man's land. In 1921, General Pershing of the French army published La Massacre de Notre Infanterie. He claimed 75,000 French soldiers had been killed or wounded by their own artillery between 1914 and 1918, roughly 1.5% of all French casualties during the war. Across the line, the German 49th Artillery Regiment was nicknamed the 48th by its own infantry, because so many of its shells fell short of the German line and landed on the men they were meant to protect. On the 25th of July 1944, outside Saint-Lô, Operation Cobra began with a carpet bombing along the Perrier Road. A premature run the day before had already fallen inside American lines, but the second attempt was even worse. 35 heavy bombers and 42 medium bombers released their payloads on their own men, killing 111 American soldiers and wounding a further 490. Lieutenant General Leslie McNairn's body was reportedly hurled 80 feet into the air from a slit trench. He was the highest ranking American soldier to die in the European theatre. He had been placed in nominal command of a fictitious army group, part of Operation Fortune, the Allied effort to convince the Germans the real invasion would land at Pas-de-Calais. His death was kept quiet for weeks to fool the Germans, so he was buried in secret. The 30th Division reported 164 cases of combat exhaustion from the bombing alone. A company commander of the 8th Infantry described it afterwards. The dive bombers came in beautifully, then they came right on top of us. A lot of the men were sitting around after the bombing in a complete daze. I called Battalion and told them I was in no condition to move. Battalion said no, push off, jump off immediately. The military journalist SLA Marshall interviewed soldiers on the battlefields across Europe just days after combat and published Men Against Fire in 1947. Military leaders acted on his findings immediately. Only 15% of riflemen fired at the enemy, and the best companies managed 1 man in 4. A new generation of officers went into Korea and Vietnam with Marshall's figures in mind. Decades later, Roger Spieler went back to Marshall's notebooks and found no trace of the questions that would have produced those numbers. Marshall's longtime colleague, Hugh Cole, put it plainly. Sam had no idea as to what precise percentage actually fired their weapons. The first major post-war study of battle command was partially manufactured, but the army trained on it anyway. From July of 1967 to June of 1969, a US military team extracted bullets and shell fragments from dead and wounded American soldiers to trace where each piece of metal had come from. About 6% of the men they examined had been hit by their own side. Charles Schrader's 1982 review puts the figure lower, it's something less than 2%. Unsurprisingly, that was the number the institution preferred. Author Catherine Kinney argues that friendly fire has existed in every modern war, but it's in Vietnam that Americans killing Americans became one of the defining images of the war, from napalm to short artillery rounds and men shot walking back into their own perimeters. On the 18th of February 1970, Sergeant Michael Mullen was killed near Tam Kai City when South Vietnamese artillery fell short onto his platoon's night position. A sergeant and a priest arrived at the Mullen farm in Iowa a few days later. Michael's mother Peg asked to see the telegram. She read that Michael had died as a result of friendly fire. She asked the sergeant to explain the phrase. He couldn't tell her much. She asked why the word accidental wasn't in the message. Because it was no accident, he said.
Word that Iraq has invaded neighboring state of Kuwait, with fighting reported along the border. The residents say that they were awakened by machine gun fire and heavy artillery.
The 1991 Gulf War was sold as the war technology had finally caught up with. Precision-guided munitions, thermal imaging, AWACS aircraft, which were essentially flying radar stations, and IFF transponders, short for Identification Friend or Foe, which were used to ping between aircraft to keep the wrong ones from being shot down. The Pentagon's own report to Congress on the conduct of the Persian Gulf War describes a force with better situational awareness than any army in history, but there were still a lot of numbers that didn't add up. Of 146 Americans killed in combat, 35 died from friendly fire. Of 467 wounded, 72 were from friendly fire, roughly a quarter of US combat deaths. Stuart Powell, writing for Air Force magazine, noted that as a share of casualties, the Gulf War figure was far higher than any previous conflict on record. The weapons had gotten better, yet somehow the ratios had gotten worse. On the 17th of February 1991, an Apache helicopter firing Hellfire missiles through a thermal sight destroyed a US M2 Bradley and an M113 armoured personnel carrier. 2 soldiers had died and 6 were wounded. The GAO report found the crew had made a navigation error and deviated from approach procedure, but engaged what they genuinely believed were enemy vehicles. Their thermal imaging returned no warnings. The Office of Technology Assignments report, who goes there, friend or foe, had a more clear-cut finding. At the start of Desert Storm, US ground forces had no working IFF systems comparable to that used by the Air Force. They had air-to-air systems, but the flaws these systems had were well known. The Pentagon had known about the combat identification problem for years before Desert Storm and hadn't fixed it. 3 years later, on the 14th of April 1994, 2 US Air Force F-15s were patrolling the no-fly zone over Kurdish northern Iraq as part of Operation Provide Comfort. They intercepted 2 helicopters inside the exclusion area, which they visually identified as Iraqi Hinds, and fired. But they turned out to be US Army Black Hawks, carrying American, British, French, Turkish and Kurdish personnel. There were 26 people on board, and there were no survivors. An AWACS aircraft had been overhead the whole time. The Black Hawk's IFF transponders had been operating, yet the F-15 pilot's own IFF integrators returned no friendly signal, so they closed to visual range, called in a VID, a visual identification, and engaged. Scott Snook's study of the shootdown, published by Princeton University, didn't seek to point the finger at any one person. He traced what he called practical drift, dozens of small, reasonable deviations from standard procedure accumulated across units that had stopped talking to each other the way the rules assumed and regulations mandated. One officer was held accountable. The AWACS senior director was court-martialed and later acquitted. Nobody else faced charges. On the 22nd of April 2004, on a ridge in eastern Afghanistan, Pat Tillman and Private Brian O'Neill came under fire from a vehicle in their own platoon. The two had lost radio contact in a narrow canyon. Tillman popped a smoke grenade to signal their position. The shooting stopped, But as they stood up, the vehicle opened fire again. Tillman took rounds to his chest plate. He quickly began shouting, "I'm Pat fucking Tillman! Why are you shooting at me?" Trevor Alders, the saw gunner, testified that he'd seen arms raised through his sight, but didn't read them as a ceasefire. He fired another 10-round burst, and Tillman was hit 3 times in the head from less than 120 feet away. That night, Captain Bovard ordered Sergeant Valdez to burn Tillman's uniform, body armour and notebook in an oil drum, alone, to prevent what Bovard called leaks and rumours. When his body reached Dover stripped of his clothing, Chief Medical Examiner Craig Mallock, who'd mandated months earlier that uniforms and armour accompany every body as forensic evidence, was not told he was looking at a case of fratricide. Within hours of the shooting, Lieutenant Colonel Bailey directed that Tillman be recommended for a Silver Star. 2 witness statements were prepared. O'Neill's was so heavily embellished he refused to sign it, and Sergeant Ward didn't even recognise his. Both would go forward unsigned nonetheless. On the 29th of April, Les Brownlee, Acting Secretary of the Army, signed the commendation. The same day, Major General Stanley McChrystal, the senior officer overseeing Ranger operations, sent a classified memo to 3 generals, not to correct the record, but to warn that public statements about Tillman could prove embarrassing if the truth leaked. President Bush would praise Tillman 2 days later at the Correspondents' Dinner, and unsurprisingly, he said nothing about how he died.
The loss of Army Corporal Pat Tillman last week in Afghanistan brought home the sorrow that comes with every loss, and reminds us of the character of the men and women who serve on our behalf. Friends say that this young man saw the images of September the 11th, and seeing that evil, he felt called to defend America.
His family wasn't told for 5 weeks, and O'Neill had been ordered to not speak. Russell Baer, a ranger in the platoon, flew home with Pat's coffin on an empty cargo plane, under orders to not say anything to Pat's brother Kevin. When the army disclosed the fratricide, they handed Mary Tillman 3,000 pages of documents, and every name was blacked out.
At the end of the briefing, we were told that we would be getting these source documents that were used to support the investigation. They showed me the box. It was 6 binders full of stuff. Eventually, Mr. Tillman, you're going to get a copy of all this. I said, great. When am I going to get it?
She sat at her kitchen table and counted the character spaces in each redaction, trying to match the gaps to soldiers she knew. In April of 2007, Kevin Tillman testified before the House of Representatives that his brother's death had been turned into an inspirational message that served to support the nation's foreign policy wars. Various recipients of McChrystal's memo were called before Congress. In 3 hours of testimony, all any of them offered were variations of "I don't recall," 82 times. One officer was disciplined. Lieutenant General Kensinger was censured for lying under oath to investigators, but he had already retired. Pat did everything right on that ridge. He'd thrown a smoke grenade, stood up and even resorted to waving and shouting his own name. Yet from 42 yards away, someone from his own platoon killed him. Since time immemorial, much of human history has been written in the silence that follows the dust, panic and confusion of war. From the Greeks stabbing their own men in the dark, to French gunners in 1917 that managed to kill more of their own infantry than the Germans did. Even as times changed and technology evolved, that didn't stop 2 F-15s shooting down Black Hawk helicopters and killing all 26 of their occupants. Pat Tillman's death was followed by a web of lies, from burning his uniform to forging citations, suppressing the cause of death from his own family, and circulating memos warning of the embarrassment that the truth could cause. They believed the nation needed a hero, and they were willing to cover up a case of friendly fire to make that happen. His name, the one the military wanted to venerate across every television screen in America, still wasn't enough to save him on that ridge.